This video is brought to you in part by OmniAtlas. Feedback from viewers and patrons is one of the most important parts of my creative process, and probably the most common compliment I get is for my maps, whether they be for cities or the political maps of countries and regions. The cities I do myself, but the latter would be impossible without OmniAtlas, a free interactive historical atlas which shows step-by-step historical maps covering major world and regional events. Unlike many other historical atlases, OmniAtlas seeks to show political influence and control, not just territorial claims or legal definitions, so that means disputed territories, invading armies, rebellions, you name it. I started working with OmniAtlas years before I started my channel, and the quality of my videos would not be possible without OmniAtlas providing their pre-existing maps or their template and style guide for making my own maps. You can check out their link in the description. Now, on with the show.
In my opinion, I am not a military man, and I am willing to take up weapons only when I cannot see any other alternative.
Josef Trumpeldor didn't grow up in the Pale of Settlement. 24 years before his birth, his father Wolf had been a Cantonist, one of many Jewish child soldiers abducted into the Russian army during the Crimean War. For a generation, the Cantonist system had been intended as a means to forcibly convert and assimilate the empire's vast Jewish population. But like most, Wolf Trumpeldor remained faithful to Judaism, even refusing an officer commission in exchange for baptism. Russia's catastrophic defeat in that war resulted in the abolition of the Cantonist program. At the same time, Wolf's military service made him a so-called useful Jew, eligible to live outside the Pale of Settlement to which most other Jews were confined. For this reason, Josef and his siblings grew up in faraway Piatigorsk, a town of 18,000 people but only 332 Jews, and enjoyed an upbringing far removed from the violence and discrimination of the Pale. Josef wasn't immune from discrimination, nor was he blind to the broader Jewish experience. As a teenager, he developed a fast fascination with both socialism and Zionism. But his upbringing was just as Russian as it was Jewish. He particularly idolized the novelist and philosopher Count Leo Tolstoy, and from a young age he adopted Tolstoy's philosophy of nonviolence by becoming a strict pacifist and vegetarian. But then, in 1902, his draft number came up, forcing him to make some difficult decisions. To be a Jew in the Imperial Russian Army was a humiliating and potentially deadly existence, and not just for the normal reasons that would apply to any soldier. As far back as 1874, Emperor Alexander II had abolished the useful status of Jewish soldiers, forcing new recruits to return to the Pale of Settlement immediately after being discharged. In the 1880s, while Interior Minister Nikolai Ignatiev had rolled out a series of new discriminatory laws against Jewish civilians, Minister of War Pyotr Vanovsky had introduced a series of temporary regulations curbing the rights of Jewish soldiers, instituting a cap on Jewish medical personnel on the grounds that their presence was inherently unsanitary, while simultaneously increasing the quota of Jewish soldiers to a disproportionate degree by excluding them from exemptions for only children, heads of household, and the physically disabled. In 1886, Jewish men who had emigrated out of the country were declared to be illegal draft dodgers, imposing a massive fine on their remaining family members. And that's just what was on the books. Only 9 Jewish soldiers in Russian history had ever been commissioned as officers, and none since 1886, indicating an unofficial return to earlier policies which mandated conversion to Christianity in exchange for advancement. Furthermore, all of these practices were explicitly rooted in notions that Jews were biologically weak and unpatriotic, encouraging Gentile recruits to murder their Jewish comrades as an unofficial morale-building exercise, which in turn necessitated the equally unofficial establishment of segregated Jewish units. All of which is to say that Josef Trumpeldor's apprehensions towards serving weren't only based on his pacifist beliefs, but also a well-founded fear of mistreatment. Ironically, one of the only legal means by which a Jewish soldier could get out of military service was to be a conscientious objector, which Trumpeldor, by any definition, was. And yet, he chose to serve. Much as he abhorred the idea of killing, he also felt an even greater ethical responsibility to demonstrate the valor of the Jewish people, and thereby expose the folly of anti-Semitism. So he went willingly. Because of those same discriminatory policies, most Jewish soldiers were deployed to the Far East. As you might guess, being assigned to Siberia wasn't seen as comfortable or prestigious. It certainly wasn't supposed to be. Amazingly, Trumpeldor got an assignment to serve as a regimental dentist in the military district of Kiev, right in the heart of the Pale of Settlement. But this isn't where he'd stay. When war with Japan broke out in February 1904, an assignment to the Far East suddenly became prestigious and desirable. Eager to prove his mettle, Trumpeldor put in for a transfer to serve in combat among his fellow Jews of the 7th Siberian Rifle Division at Port Arthur. To say that tensions between Russia and Japan had been high would be a grievous understatement. Russia's eastward expansion had been a project centuries in the making, the ultimate experiment in strategic depth. In the previous century, the Russian Empire had even extended into North America, as far east as California. But in more recent decades, Russia's ambitions extended towards China. As the only European power to share a land border with the beleaguered Qing dynasty, they had taken advantage of China's unprecedented weakness to annex large areas of Manchuria with the eventual goal of acquiring the entire region and becoming a major player in the Pacific. Japan's imperial expansion had been more recent, but far more rapid. After abandoning isolationism in the 1850s and a civil war in the 1860s, the country had adopted a Western-style constitution, a modern conscript army modeled on that of Germany, a state-of-the-art British-built navy, and even a new national sport in the form of American baseball. Following war with China in 1894, Japan extracted massive concessions on the Asian mainland, but was forced to give up many of its gains under pressure from the European powers. Instead, it was Russia who took advantage of the Japanese victory, extracting concessions to build railroads in Manchuria, and even acquiring Japan's desired colony at Port Arthur. Finally, during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, Russia occupied all of Manchuria, agreeing to withdraw in 1902, but never actually doing so. This terrified the Japanese, who in July 1903 began a series of negotiations with the Winter Palace with two main objectives. First, they demanded that Russia honor its earlier promise to withdraw from Manchuria, as this violated not only Chinese sovereignty, but Japan's existing rights to build railways in that region. Second, the Japanese demanded an agreement to recognize the independence of Korea in order to safeguard their own strategic depth. But the Russians wouldn't even agree to these modest terms, and as negotiations progressed, they even began demanding Japan give up some of its existing privileges. The reason for this was simple. Russia had never been interested in a diplomatic solution, instead using the negotiations as a stalling tactic in order to prepare for the war that they had always intended on fighting. Back in Europe, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany had spent nearly a decade promoting his personal beliefs that Japan's rise on the world stage represented the beginning of what he called Yellow Peril, an existential threat to both Christianity and white supremacy by the peoples of East Asia, which could only be defeated in a divinely ordained race war led by his own cousin, Emperor Nikolai of Russia. This idea appealed greatly to Nikolai. As a young man, he had visited Japan and narrowly escaped assassination by an ultranationalist police officer. He loathed the Japanese, referred to them as monkeys, and held them in much the same regard as he did Jews, occasionally useful, but ultimately undesirable and threatening. So as Russia began to mobilize its forces in the Far East, Interior Minister Vyacheslav von Plehve began preparing pamphlets, posters, and university lectures promoting the conflict as a biological event by which the massive and innately rugged Russian army would exterminate the weak and godless Asian race. This turned out to be great propaganda for the Japanese, who could now position themselves as the defenders of Asian peoples against European domination. And among those Asian peoples, the Japanese included Jews. At the same time Russia was dragging out negotiations, the empire had become profoundly isolated and unpopular in the West due to the massacre of Jews in the city of Kishinev by hardcore Russian nationalists. There is no doubt that many Japanese politicians felt a genuine affinity for a fellow Asian people rising to challenge Russian oppression. Indeed, with Japan spending a whopping 31% of its GDP on the military in 1904, the vice president of the Bank of Japan deliberately sought out the outspoken Jewish-American financier Jacob Schiff to assist in the eventual post-war recovery. But more immediately, the international backlash to Kishinev convinced the Japanese cabinet that the Western powers wouldn't oppose Japan in the event of a preemptive strike. And so the war began. On the night of the 8th of February, the Japanese Navy ambushed the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. Just hours later, Japanese troops landed at Incheon, and by the end of April they had reached the Russian line at the Yalu River. Panicked by his army's failure, Emperor Nikolai dispatched the Baltic Fleet under Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvensky on a long, deadly journey to relieve his forces on the other side of the world. But it was already too late. By the time the Baltic Fleet set sail, the Japanese had already invaded the Liaodong Peninsula and completely surrounded Port Arthur. When the Baltic Fleet finally arrived in May, there was no siege to relieve, and what remained of the Russian Navy was almost entirely wiped out at the Battle of Tsushima. Though fighting on land would continue for a couple more months, the war was effectively over, and for the Russian Empire, it had been a catastrophic defeat. Now, if all this sounds strangely familiar to you, it did to me too. So for help understanding how Russia was so badly beaten, I reached out to Ryan Macbeth, an IT specialist and US Army veteran who's recently come to prominence here on YouTube for his analysis of Russia's recent shortcomings in their war against Ukraine, particularly in the areas of logistics, coordination, and training. As you'll soon see, these three elements were the key to Russia's defeat.
Now it's time to talk about technology, training, and tactics. Hi, I'm Ryan Macbeth, retired infantryman and intelligence analyst. Technology was roughly the same for both sides at the time of the war, with a slight advantage to Russia. The primary weapon on Russia's side was the three-line rifle M1891, also known as the Mosin Nagant. This was a 5-shot 7.62 by 54 millimeter rifle with a range of about 500 meters. And it was a darn good rifle. Even today, Russia won World War II on that rifle. Russian machine gun teams used 40 Vickers model 1901 chambered in 7.62 by 54. These weapons were water-cooled, big and bulky, and mounted on gun carriages, but they could be very effective in the defense. Finally, Russia had the M76 Putlov M1900 gun, a modern artillery piece with a revolutionary recoil dampening spring, so you didn't have to re-aim after firing. This weapon had a range of a little over 8 kilometers. The Japanese had a few different kinds of rifles. The first was a Type 30 rifle chambered in 6.5 by 50, a cartridge that was a little underpowered compared to their Russian counterparts. The sights could go up to 2,000 meters. In reality, anybody would find it difficult to hit anything beyond 500 meters. For machine guns, the Japanese had the Hotchkiss 1897 that were air-cooled and fed from a 30-round feed tray. These weapons heated up really fast, and since they were rechambered from French 8mm to Japanese 6.5mm, they were subject to frequent jamming. It got to the point that the Japanese kept their machine gun cartridges, not even the gun, the cartridges, oiled, which helped a little with the jamming problem. For artillery, Japan was also at a disadvantage. It had the Type 31 75mm quick-firing gun, but it had no recoil system, meaning the gun had to be re-aimed after every shot, and the range is about 1,000 meters shorter than Russian artillery. So on paper, Russia had a technology advantage with weapons, but numbers on paper don't win wars. Japan may have had slightly worse equipment, but they had much better training. The average Russian soldier was only allotted 125 rounds during their basic training, and only 20 of those rounds were used for qualification. Russian marksmanship was horrible. Japanese, on the other hand, really concentrated on marksmanship. Instructors used to tell soldiers to pull the trigger as carefully and gently as the frost falls on a cold night. The Japanese also had the advantage of Western instructors. See, back in the late 1800s, Japan was forced with a choice. They could open themselves up to the West and embrace the West's ideas and technology, or they could try to remain closed like China and ultimately be carved up just like China. Japan chose to remain relevant, so they adopted a very Western military style. They formed engineering schools, and in 1867, the first Japanese military academy, which was initially taught by French instructors, was formed. Japan began the Russo-Japanese War with a professional, well-trained, European-like army. Russia began the war with a not-so-professional military. In Russia at the time, there was no requirement for higher education to become an officer, and officers were promoted by favor, not abilities. In fact, Russia didn't even create a military academy until 1918. On paper, the Russian military seemed stronger and had better weapons, but it had the fatal flaw of poor leadership. Now, all of this boiled down to some pretty interesting tactics. The Russians learned two things very quickly. Their infantry couldn't hit a darn thing, and their artillery advantage was negated because the soldiers didn't know how to use the equipment. The manual for the Putilov M1900 gun wouldn't come out until 4 months into the war. So instead, the Russians would wait until the Japanese got very close, like 10 to 12 meters, and then use machine guns with interlocking fields of fire to mow down the Japanese at the last second. The Japanese took horrendous casualties, but they made changes. First, they started using forward observers who could contact the artillery with a telephone wire that they trailed behind them back to the guns to adjust the gun's fire during the attack. Second, the Japanese carried sandbags with them so that when they got close to Russian lines, they would drop the sandbags, get behind them, and start digging their own trench lines. I'm serious. Finally, once the Japanese got a foothold, they would bring up their machine guns on specially designed sleds mounted to the guns so the guns could remain low to the ground and advance with the infantry. Russia had every tactical advantage in weapons, but it blew it on the training and tactics.
By the beginning of August 1904, the Japanese had captured the main commercial center at Dalian and began moving in towards Port Arthur, finally bringing Josef Trumpeldor face to face with the enemy. But only 6 days into the siege, Trumpeldor was severely wounded by shrapnel, necessitating the amputation of most of his left arm and an indefinite stay in the hospital. No one would have expected him to return to combat, but Trumpeldor was adamant on doing exactly that, and wrote as much in a letter to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Petrusha. In an officer corps where political favoritism and nepotism were almost always rewarded over merit, Trumpeldor's Gentile commanders at Port Arthur were uncommonly educated and competent, and largely treated their Jewish soldiers with respect. Petrusha, for his part, was so impressed by Trumpeldor's letter that he not only had him reinstated by the 15th of December, but had him promoted to the rank of warrant officer and applied to have him awarded with the 4th degree of the Cross of St. George. For Trumpeldor's future, the implications of this recognition would be far-reaching. But at the time, it hardly mattered. Less than 3 weeks after returning to the front, Port Arthur surrendered, and Trumpeldor was taken alongside 10,000 of his comrades to Hamadera prison camp in the small village of Takaishi, south of Osaka. To be a Russian soldier at Hamadera would have been a bizarre experience. Adhering to old-fashioned ideas of Russian ruggedness, conscript service in the Imperial Army could be a brutal experience even in the best of circumstances. So most found themselves enjoying a higher quality of life as prisoners of the Japanese than they had under their own commanders. In accordance with the rules of war, as well as their own propaganda aims, the Japanese army had spared no expense in accommodating these prisoners. There was no forced labor, they were free to write home to their families, they were given allowances, and access to health care was no object. Only at Hamadera was Trumpeldor finally outfitted with a prosthetic arm. Of the 10,000 prisoners at Hamadera, a whopping 1,739 were Jewish, and they were the lucky ones. Of the 33,000 Jewish soldiers who served in the Russian army during the war, 3,000 were killed. Fearing the possibility of a pogrom on Japanese soil, the Ministry of the Army arranged to have Jewish soldiers segregated, so it was ironically in Japan that Trumpeldor had his first significant interactions with a large Jewish community, and obtained permission to form his own Zionist group, the Captive Sons of Zion in Japan. Like most Jews in the Russian Empire up to that point, Most of Trumpeldor's fellow captives remained religiously orthodox and depoliticized, but a small minority did join the captive Sons of Zion, where they proved instrumental to shaping one of the most iconic institutions of the Zionist movement. Even before Zionism properly began in the 1880s, those interested in resettling Jewish refugees in Palestine had been emphatic about the need to return to farming, since it seemingly offered a more dignified, healthy, and traditionally rooted way of life than a squalid existence in the cities. Accordingly, all of the new Jewish communities established in the first Aliyah had been farming villages. But the majority of Zionists at this time were some variety of socialist, and therefore belonged to an ideology based around urbanized industrial societies. So how do you reconcile these two visions? The idea that began to percolate between Trumpeldor and his followers was for a new kind of agricultural community, in which all property would be shared and residents would operate as a workers' collective much in the same way as they would in a socialized factory. These communities would also act as strategic hamlets, tightly packed and designed for self-defense. And lo, the kibbutz was born. Nevertheless, Trumpeldor remained resolute in his allegiance to the Russian Empire. Like the foremost Zionist philosopher of the time, Ahad Ha'am, he rejected the supposed contradiction between a thriving Jewish homeland and a thriving Jewish diaspora. Russia, after all, was still home to almost half the world's Jews, and it was clear that things couldn't possibly continue there as they had before. Change was coming. In July 1905, the Japanese army invaded and occupied the Russian island of Sakhalin, ending the Russo-Japanese War. A year and a half earlier, Emperor Nikolai had anticipated that the war would be an unchallenging, one-sided victory against an unprepared and incompetent enemy. Was he wrong? While the guns fell silent in the Far East, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt invited Russian and Japanese officials to make peace at the Portsmouth Naval Yard in Kittery, Maine, an accomplishment for which he received the following year's Nobel Peace Prize. Under the treaty ratified that September, Russia was forced to withdraw from Manchuria and renounce any future territorial ambitions there, as well as to allow full Japanese annexation of southern Sakhalin. The colony of Port Arthur was ceded to Japan, as was ownership of the South Manchuria Railway, and Japan was given a military protectorate over the Korean Empire as a guarantor of security against Russia. Ironically, Japan would soon spend the next 4 decades doing to Korea exactly what the Russian Empire had done to the Jews. In 1910, Japan transitioned Korea from a protectorate to a directly ruled colony and set about attempting to forcibly assimilate the Korean people into Japanese society. Despite this betrayal, successive Japanese governments would continue to defend their colonial aggression under the guise of liberating fellow Asians from European rule. Though the treaty was concluded in early September, it would take until nearly the end of the year before all Russian prisoners were released from captivity. And during that time, Trumpeldor and his fellow Jewish prisoners published an open letter to Emperor Nikolai demanding the emancipation of Russia's Jews in recognition of their contributions to the war effort.
Your Imperial Majesty, we know that we were asked to sacrifice our lives and spill our blood out of duty to the worshipful monarch and the dear homeland. None of us would have hesitated to give our very lives in defence of Port Arthur if the need had arisen. Both we and the myriads of Jews who watch us and wish us to fulfil our duty grieve every Russian loss. We know that Jews in Russia lack many rights, but we who love His Majesty and the homeland very much would like to ask for the Emperor's attention. Together we have gathered our courage. We who know His Imperial Majesty's merciful heart meekly ask that the Jews be given the rights afforded to the other peoples of Russia for the mercy for which we have waited so long.
The outcome of the war was indeed a moment of reckoning for the Winter Palace. Months of chauvinistic propaganda denying even the remotest possibility of a Japanese victory could no longer conceal reality. This defeat had also come at an enormous cost domestically. Though Finance Minister Sergei Witte had spent the previous years desperately trying to expand Russian industry, his efforts had proven woefully inadequate for the war effort, and in fact further destabilized internal politics as Russian soldiers fired on striking workers in what was known as Bloody Sunday. In decades past, Russian culture had upheld the emperor as someone above politics. In times of difficulty, the common refrain was, if only the emperor knew, because he couldn't fail the Russian people, only be failed by interfering forces. Even Trumpeldor's appeal for Jewish emancipation at the end of the war reflected this old attitude. But back home, defeat by Japan had finally eradicated such illusions, doing for the whole Russian population what the Kishinev pogrom 2 years earlier had done for the empire's Jews. This was Nikolai's war. The emperor knew. As the war drew to a close, soldiers and sailors began mutinying against their commanders, most famously exemplified in the revolt of the battleship Potemkin in Odessa. Finally, on the 30th of October, Witte finally convinced Emperor Nikolai to issue a manifesto promising to hold elections to a new parliament with universal male suffrage and a constitution. While the October Manifesto was only a non-binding declaration of intent, it did result in parliamentary elections the following winter. And while Jews remained unemancipated, the new set of voting eligibility requirements meant that many Jewish men not only voted for the Duma, but were elected to it. However, not all Russians were happy with this outcome. As the Revolution of 1905 unfolded, Pavel Krushevin, chief instigator of the Kishinev pogrom and author of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, joined forces with other hardline reactionaries under Dr. Alexander Dubrovin to form the Union of Russian People, better known as the Black Hundreds, committed to upholding absolute monarchy, Russian racial supremacy, and anti-Semitism. Just a day after the publication of the October Manifesto, Krushevin and others began marching through the streets of almost every city in the empire, handing out pamphlets and flyers which blamed Jews for both the Japanese victory and the military crackdown on striking workers over the prior months, and called on Russian patriots to defend themselves against their new political freedoms by attacking the Jews wherever they were found. In the 11 days following the October Manifesto, the Black Hundreds led 690 pogroms in 660 cities, towns, and villages, not only in the Pale of Settlement, but as far east as Irkutsk, where Black Hundreds agitators attacked and on occasion murdered Jewish soldiers returning home from the war. 2 years earlier, the Kishinev pogrom, which had been one of the major turning points in Jewish history, a defining tragedy, had resulted in 49 deaths over 3 days in a single provincial city. What came to be called the Second Kishinev pogrom resulted in the deaths of 4,000 Jews. 400 alone were killed in Odessa, where the riots initially began. But the worst of the pogroms took place in the agricultural colonies of Chernigov province. This was one of the few areas of the Pale where Jews had been allowed to practice agriculture. Families like the Aronovs had been working the land since the Napoleonic Wars, and their isolation had made urban-style pogroms rare. But now, their small villages made them easy targets. 1 in every 5 Jews killed in Kishinev II were killed here, leading almost every family remaining in the countryside to flee for the relative safety of the cities. For most such survivors, this wouldn't be their last move. The self-defense groups organized by Jewish political movements after the first Kishinev pogrom fought back hard, but they weren't sufficiently widespread and stood little chance against the many police officers, demobilized soldiers, and Cossack mercenaries who rallied to the side of the Black Hundreds. At the beginning of October, Trumpeldor had begun to despair of remaining in captivity. Though his Zionist ideals had crystallized into a coherent ideology at Hamadra, in the moment, he still wanted nothing more than to return to his beloved Russia. But by the time of his release in mid-December, all such notions of the motherland had been wiped from his mind. He spent much of the following winter giving lectures on Zionism in Harbin, a majority Russian city which had served as the main hub of the Chinese Eastern Railway, but was nevertheless in China, and since the end of the war had reverted to Chinese sovereignty. Though Harbin had enjoyed a small Jewish community since the construction of the railway, it was rapidly becoming a refuge for demobilized Jewish soldiers and their families who, like Trumpeldor, found themselves uneager to return to Russia. Most of them never did. Trumpeldor himself, however, had little choice. By the end of the war, he'd become not only the highest-ranking Jewish soldier in the Russian army, but the most decorated Jewish soldier in Russian history, and was summoned to St. Petersburg to receive the first, third, and fourth degrees of the Cross of St. George from Emperor Nikolai himself. To add to his honors, Nikolai offered Trumpeldor an opportunity few Jews had ever received: to resume his university education fully paid for by the imperial crown, and thereafter take the exam to become an officer. Trumpeldor said no. Even in 1906, while Jews were voting alongside Gentiles for the new parliament, pogroms were ongoing in Gomel, Bialystok, and Siedlitsa, with police and many of his fellow soldiers actively joining or even leading the violence. And even as a decorated war hero, he'd still have points automatically deducted from his officer's exam for being Jewish. In any case, he had already given up on any hope for Russia. He resigned from the army, resumed his education as a civilian, and began planning for his escape to Palestine. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Kossoff, and Eric Liederman.